Nadia had never once in her life considered that the way a person dressed had anything to do with their worth. But Fatima did. Fatima believed it with everything she had. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that came in slow and heavy in mid-July, with the heat already pressing down on everything before 9 o'clock. The urgent care clinic on Briarwood Avenue had just opened its doors, and the waiting room was still mostly empty. A few plastic chairs, a television mounted in the corner, playing the local news on mute, and the faint smell of antiseptic that never quite left the air, no matter how many air fresheners the front desk put out. Fatima was behind the registration counter. She had worked there for 2 years, and in that time she had developed a very particular way of looking at people the moment they walked through the door, not at their faces, at their clothes. She said it was because she could tell right away who had insurance, who would pay their copay without arguing, and who was going to make her afternoon miserable. She had said this out loud once to a colleague, laughing about it like it was a skill. The colleague had not laughed back. Nadia was at the far end of the counter, updating charts on her computer. She was 28 years old, had been working at Briarwood Urgent Care for just under a year, and she had learned very quickly that the best way to survive a shift with Fatima was to keep her head down and her mouth busy with something other than opinions. That Tuesday morning, the door opened at 9:14. The man who walked in was older, maybe 60, maybe 65. He wore work pants, the kind with multiple pockets along the thighs, faded from washing. His boots were steel-toed and scuffed. His hands were large and calloused, the kind that came from decades of physical work, and there was a faint grease line under his fingernails that soap had not fully reached. He wore a plain grey t-shirt, and the collar was slightly frayed. He walked with a slight slowness, not a limp exactly, more like the careful movement of someone whose knees had carried weight for a long time. He approached the counter quietly, took off his worn baseball cap, and held it in both hands. "Good morning," he said. His voice was low and polite. "I was hoping to be seen today if possible. I've been having some chest tightness, and I wanted to get it checked out before it becomes something." Fatima looked at him. She looked at him the way she always did, starting at the boots, moving up slowly, finishing at the face. Then she looked back down at her computer as if she had decided something. "Do you have insurance?" she asked. Not unkindly, exactly, but without warmth. The way someone asks a question they already think they know the answer to. "Yes, ma'am," the man said. He reached into his pocket and produced a card. Set it on the counter gently. Fatima picked it up. Read it. Set it back down. Her expression did not change, but something in the angle of her shoulders did. A subtle dismissal, like she had confirmed what she thought. "It'll be a wait," she said. "We have several patients ahead of you." "Of course," the man said. "I don't mind waiting. I just want to make sure this gets looked at today. We'll see what we can do," Fatima said. Then she turned back to her computer. The man nodded, picked up his cap and walked to the waiting area. He chose a seat near the window. He did not take out a phone. He sat with his cap in his lap and looked out at the parking lot with the patient, steady stillness of someone who had spent a great deal of his life waiting. Nadia had watched all of it. She looked back at her screen and said nothing. She told herself it was fine. She told herself Fatima had not said anything technically wrong. Chest tightness was a priority concern, yes, but they did have other patients ahead. It was not unreasonable. She kept telling herself that for 11 minutes. At 9:25, a woman came in wearing clean white slacks, a silk blouse, and carrying a handbag that Nadia recognized as expensive without knowing the brand exactly, the way you recognize something without being able to explain how. The woman had a paper cut on her index finger. Fatima smiled at her before she even reached the counter. "Good morning. Come right on in. Let me get you set up." Nadia stood up from her chair. She walked around the counter, crossed the waiting room, and sat down in the empty chair next to the man in the grey t-shirt and the scuffed boots. "Sir," she said quietly, "I want to apologize for the wait. I also want to let you know that chest tightness is something we take seriously here. I'm going to personally make sure you're seen in the next few minutes. Can I get your name?" The man turned from the window and looked at her. His eyes were dark brown and steady. "Ellison," he said. "Bernard Ellison." "Mr. Ellison," Nadia said. "I'll be right back." She went back to the counter, typed his name in, and flagged his intake form as high priority. Fatima noticed. She said nothing while a patient was nearby, but the moment Mr. Ellison was called back to an exam room, 4 minutes later, she turned to Nadia with an expression that was not quite anger but was something adjacent to it. "I had him scheduled," Fatima said. "His chief complaint was chest tightness," Nadia said. "We don't let those wait. I know the protocols." "Okay," Nadia said simply, and went back to her charts. What happened next was nothing dramatic. Mr. Ellison was seen by Dr. Okafor, was found to have a slightly elevated blood pressure and an irregular heartbeat worth monitoring, was referred to a cardiologist, and left the clinic with paperwork and a follow-up appointment. He stopped at the front desk on his way out and looked at Nadia. "Thank you," he said. "You treated me like a person. That's the job," Nadia said. He nodded once, put his cap back on, and walked out into the heat. Fatima watched him go. "He probably could have waited," she said, not quite under her breath. Nadia didn't respond. The weeks that followed were ordinary, the kind of weeks that stack up without announcement. Busy shifts, double bookings, a rotating cast of patients with varying degrees of impatience. Nadia worked her hours, went home to her apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that always smelled faintly of someone else's cooking, called her mother on Sundays, and tried not to carry the weight of Fatima's commentary home with her. But Fatima's commentary had a way of following you. It wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was the tone she used when a patient spoke with a heavy accent. Sometimes it was the way she would slow down the check-in process for someone who looked like they weren't in a rush, while expediting things for someone she deemed more important. She never said anything explicitly cruel. She was too careful for that. But Nadia had watched her long enough to understand the pattern, and the pattern was consistent and unkind. One afternoon in August, a teenage boy came in with his grandmother. The grandmother's English was limited, and the boy was translating, nervous, stumbling over medical terms he didn't know in either language. Fatima had looked at them with undisguised impatience, tapping her pen against the desk while the boy tried to explain. Nadia had stepped in, pulled up a translation resource on her tablet, and spent 10 extra minutes making sure the grandmother understood everything on the intake form. The boy had looked at her, like she had handed him something he didn't know he was allowed to have. Fatima had said, after they walked away, "You don't have to do all that. It slows everything down. It slows down the 10 minutes. Nadia said, "But she's going to actually follow the discharge instructions because she understood them. That saves the whole system time." Fatima had not had a response to that. She rarely did when Nadia offered her a practical counter. It was the emotional arguments she was better at dismissing, the ones that appealed to kindness, to fairness. Those she could wave away. Logic was harder to deflect. Still, nothing changed. Fatima kept doing what Fatima did, and the clinic management didn't see it because Fatima was professional in front of management, and the complaints from patients were the kind that were hard to document. A feeling, a tone, the sense that they had been looked at and found lacking before they had even opened their mouths. September came. Nadia started thinking about whether she wanted to stay. It was not that the work itself was hard. She had gone into healthcare knowing it would be hard. It was the particular exhaustion of watching someone use a position of minor authority to make other people feel small, and of knowing that the official channels would not fully see it, and of calculating, day after day, what it cost her to stay and what it would cost her to go. She had not made up her mind when October arrived and changed everything. It was a Wednesday. Nadia was on a half shift, finishing at 2 o'clock. She had eaten lunch at her desk, a turkey sandwich and an apple, the same thing she'd been bringing for 3 weeks because she hadn't had energy to think about food differently, and was shutting down her workstation when Fatima, who was on her phone at the counter, made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, the kind that meant something. Nadia looked up. Fatima was staring at her phone screen with an expression Nadia had never seen on her before. It was not her usual cool assessment. It was something closer to shock, then something closer to horror. "What?" Nadia said. Fatima didn't answer. She turned the phone slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether to show it or not, and then she set it face down on the counter and looked at the wall. Nadia picked up her bag, said goodbye, and left. She found out that evening, not from Fatima, but from a notification that popped up on her own phone while she was making dinner. A local news alert she'd set up months ago when a friend had recommended it, and then mostly forgotten about. The headline read, "Ellison Family Foundation pledges $4.2 million to expand urgent care access in underserved communities across the metro area." Below the headline was a photograph of a man standing at a podium at a press conference. He was wearing a dark suit. His shoes were polished. His white hair was neatly combed. He was smiling at a room full of people in formal attire. Nadia looked at the face for a long moment before she placed it. Bernard Ellison, grey t-shirt, scuffed boots, baseball cap held in both hands. She read the article slowly. Bernard Ellison, it turned out, was the founder of Ellison Construction, one of the largest privately held construction companies in the state. He had started the company with his brother in a garage 40 years ago, had built it into something that employed thousands of people across 8 states, and had spent the last decade quietly directing a significant portion of his wealth toward healthcare access initiatives. His wife, who had died 3 years earlier, had struggled to get consistent care late in her illness because of gaps in coverage and geography. The foundation bore her name, the Clara Ellison Foundation. The $4.2 million was going to fund mobile urgent care units that would rotate through neighborhood where access to healthcare was limited. Part of the announcement, the article noted, mentioned that the foundation had been considering several partner clinics in the area to serve as administrative hubs for the initiative. Briarwood Urgent Care had been on the preliminary list. Had been. The article quoted Mr. Ellison briefly at the end. He said the foundation had visited several facilities over the summer and had been paying attention not just to their capabilities but to their culture. He said, and the article quoted him directly, that his late wife had always told him that how a place treats the people who can do nothing for them is the truest measure of what that place actually is. Nadia stood in her kitchen for a long time, with her phone in her hand, and the stove on and the water beginning to boil. She was not thinking about the money. She was thinking about a man sitting in a plastic chair by a window with a baseball cap in his lap, waiting with a quiet dignity that did not require anyone's recognition to be real. She was thinking about the 11 minutes she had spent, telling herself everything was fine. She was thinking about what it would have cost her, really, to do sooner what she eventually did. The next morning, Nadia arrived at work to find the clinic quieter than usual. Dr. Okafor was in early, which was unusual, and he was in the office with the clinic director, which was more unusual still. 2 other administrative staff were clustered near the break room talking in low voices. Fatima was at the counter. She looked the way people look when they have not slept. Not disheveled, but stretched thin, like a surface pulled too tight. She was doing her job with the mechanical precision of someone who was doing it entirely on autopilot, while her actual mind was somewhere else entirely. Nadia set her things down and logged into her workstation. "Did you see the news?" one of the other staff members said, appearing at her elbow. "I did," Nadia said. "Fatima apparently saw him here in September. She's the one who checked him in." Nadia said nothing. "Management is going over patient interaction logs. Someone mentioned to Dr. Okafor that the foundation rep. Turns out they sent someone in August too, just observing. Noted that front desk interactions were inconsistent, depending on patient presentation." Nadia said nothing. The staff member lowered her voice. "Apparently, Briarwood was removed from the partner clinic list. The letter came yesterday. $4.2 million, and we're not in it." Nadia looked at her screen. "That's a shame," she said, and meant it, though not in the way the other person expected. The official conversation happened 3 days later. The clinic director, a careful woman named Dr. Winters, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had a habit of thinking out loud in full sentences, called a staff meeting. She spoke about culture. She spoke about patient experience. She did not name anyone specifically, but she looked in certain directions at certain moments, and everyone in the room knew exactly what she meant. Fatima sat through it with her hands folded on the table and her face entirely composed. Nadia had to give her that. She did not flinch, did not look defensive, did not do anything that could be pointed to. She simply sat, and absorbed it the way someone absorbs news they have already processed alone. In private, in the dark hours of a night they could not sleep through. 2 weeks after the staff meeting, Fatima put in her resignation. She said she had found a position elsewhere. She said it professionally and left professionally, and on her last day brought a box of donuts to the break room, which was such an ordinary and human gesture that it made the whole situation feel more complicated than Nadia wanted it to be. Nadia ate a donut, glazed, and thought about how people were rarely just one thing. The weeks after Fatima left were different. Not dramatically. There was no sudden transformation of the clinic into something warm and golden. The air still smelled like antiseptic. The television still played the news on mute. People still came in anxious and sometimes rude, and sometimes desperately frightened underneath the rudeness. The work was still what it was. But the counter felt different. The people behind it felt different. A new woman named Rosalie had been brought in to cover the position temporarily, and Rosalie had a way of greeting every single person who walked through the door with the same tone. Steady, warm, professionally unhurried, regardless of what they were wearing, or what their copay was, or how they presented to the eye. It was a small thing. It was everything. In November, a letter arrived at the clinic addressed to Nadia specifically. It was on foundation letterhead. It was brief. It thanked her by name for the care she had shown during a visit in July. Stated that this particular interaction had been noted and had factored into the foundation's observations, and enclosed a personal note from Mr. Bernard Ellison himself, written in handwriting that was careful and slightly shaky, the way writing gets when you're no longer young but are still precise. He wrote that his wife, Clara, had once told him that kindness shown to someone who cannot reward you is the only kind of kindness that counts for much. He wrote that he did not know if Nadia was aware of who he was that morning or not, but that it had not appeared to matter to her either way, and that was precisely the point. He signed it simply, Bernard Ellison, and below his name, in smaller letters, in handwriting slightly different from the rest, perhaps added later, perhaps written more slowly, Clara would have liked you. Nadia sat with the letter for a long time. She was at her kitchen table, the same one where she'd stood 3 weeks earlier, with her phone in her hand and water boiling on the stove. The apartment still smelled faintly like someone else's cooking. She still hadn't figured out what to do differently about lunch. She thought about the moment she had stood up from her chair and walked across the waiting room. She thought about how small that decision had felt at the time. How ordinary, how little she had expected anything from it, except the plain satisfaction of having done what was right, which she had not even been sure, in the moment, that anyone else would consider right at all. She thought about Fatima, somewhere in a new job, with a box of donuts already forgotten, and a lesson that may or may not have reached wherever lessons need to reach to actually take root. She thought about a woman named Clara, who had struggled to get care when she needed it and had not survived, and whose name was now on a foundation that was trying to make sure other people didn't face the same door closed in their face. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it in the drawer where she kept things she wanted to keep. Then she got up, put water on for tea, and went back to figuring out what to do about lunch.